10 years on from Horsegate, a decade to celebrate. The horsemeat scandal of 2013 prompted action from the food industry and some governments against food fraud. 10 years later, have we made progress? Yes. The United Kingdom created the Food Industry Intelligence Network, the Food Authenticity Network, which is now global, and the National Food Crime Unit of the UK. And they did that based on the recommendations of Professor Chris Elliott in his review of the crisis, which was commissioned by the United Kingdom government. Chris recently wrote about the progress we've made on food fraud in the past decade in New Food magazine. He's positive about the gains we've made since 2013. And this is what he said in his article. The response from industry and government to defend the nation against fraudsters and indeed organised crime in the food sector has been enormously beneficial and makes life far more difficult for criminals. We have made great progress since 2013, but it's easy to forget how far our industry has come in our fight against food fraud. We are now paying more attention to food fraud and we're much more aware of its potential to hurt consumers and brands. There are more tools and technologies available to food businesses to detect and deter food fraud than in 2013. Analytical test methods, equipment and expertise are slowly becoming cheaper and more accessible. Back in 2013, species identification tests were not routinely performed on red meat. The horse meat for beef issue was only discovered because a sharp-eyed food inspector in Ireland noticed discrepancies on the labels and cartons of frozen beef at a small import-export business. At the time, the head of the Irish Food Safety Authority was astounded and thought there had been a mistake in the testing when the first sets of results were received, which showed almost 30% horse meat in the beef. These days, it's easy to have meat tested to determine its species, and there are cost-effective test kits available for both raw and cooked meat. However, the bad guys, as Professor Elliott says, won't stop trying to make money from food fraud. It can be very profitable and it carries a low risk of prosecution and punishment compared to other nefarious activities like smuggling drugs across international borders. One commentator estimated that it is 3 times more profitable to make and sell fake olive oil than to smuggle cocaine. In recent years, there have been frequent claims in the media that food fraud is getting worse or is an increasing problem, but there's no evidence to support those claims. Food fraud is, by its nature, difficult to measure. As an industry, we're certainly talking about food fraud more, and there are more frequent reports about food fraud, but this doesn't mean it's more prevalent. We do need to remain vigilant, of course, because food fraud is not going away. One risk is that as big food companies and wealthy countries pay more attention to food fraud, the fraudsters will increasingly target commodities, companies and regions where there is less oversight. The low-hanging fruit. These are the areas that are increasingly at risk as well-resourced companies increase scrutiny of their supply chains. In some regions where consumers and businesses are experiencing economic hardship, there is increasing motivation for previously legitimate food businesses to cut corners and for consumers to accept food from questionable sources, and this also increases the risks. Takeaways. As an industry, we are more aware of food fraud than before the horsemeat scandal, and we now have better tools and systems for keeping our consumers and our brands safe. However, with well-resourced food companies working harder to deter and prevent food fraud in their supply chains, other businesses in the food sector will become more attractive targets for bad actors. Don't let your food company be the low-hanging fruit for food fraud perpetrators. Keep being vigilant about the risks of food fraud in your supply chain and within your own company.